The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever. We look at stories from business leaders who've dealt with anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges, how they fell down, how they pick themselves up, and how they hope work will change in the future. Today's guest is Christopher Lochhead, a best-selling author and host of the podcast Follow Your Different. Chris is a Silicon Valley startup advisor, and he was chief marketing officer at 3 publicly traded tech companies. He's also failed a lot along the way, which we'll discuss. And like a lot of our guests, he's always working on something interesting.
And I'm always writing. I have 2 writing partners in a group we call Category Pirates. And to the best of our knowledge, Mauro, we are the only, if there's others out there, we'd love to find them, nonfiction business writing band. We put out a new single every couple weeks and call that a newsletter. And then after we get to 12 or 15 of those done, we package them up and launch that as a book.
What might be surprising about the fact that Lochhead is so prolific, though, is that he's dyslexic. He also has dyscalculia, which means that numbers and math are hard for him. But like so many others who have learning differences, he's managed to find his way and succeed outside of the system, outside of the rules and regulations, written and unwritten, that a lot of us think we have to follow to get ahead. I spoke with Chris about how his learning differences have affected him and shaped his life, why he encourages everyone to find their different, and how he stays mentally healthy. If you like Chris's story and you have one of your own, send me a message on LinkedIn. I love hearing your stories of dealing with mental health challenges, neurodiversity, anything. Send me a message. I promise I'll write back.
It's interesting. There's a lot of discussion today about being a creator and being creative. And of course, innovation's always been a big topic. And when people say creator or creative, sometimes the unspoken is much louder than the spoken. And the unspoken is that you're doing it by yourself. Mm-hmm. Creation is a very powerful thing to do as a human, of course. Co-creation is exponentially more powerful. A band is very different than a duo, and a band is certainly very different than a superstar person who hires a writer or ghostwriter, because in our case, we're all 3 equal partners.
Now, you have dyslexia.
I do, as well as many other learning differences.
What are your other learning differences?
Dyscalculia, executive function disorder, ADHD, and depression runs in my family. So most doctors tell me I'm somewhere on some kind of a spectrum for that. I put it all together and I call it dysfucklia. And here's the thing. I am very angry at those who call all of those things anything like a disability. Mm-hmm. And in the state that I live in, for my ADHD nephew to get the accommodations that will make a difference for him in school, he has to be diagnosed as having a problem. Mm-hmm. And there are many leaders in the trying to help dyslexics movement or trying to help the neurodiverse movement who come at it this way. There are dyslexics who come at it this way. And I reject all of it.
Yeah.
Dyslexia and all of that stuff is a superpower. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Now, I'm also not stupid. I live with some very serious things that I have to deal with. And I have to deal with it myself, and the people who love me have to love and support me through some of it. I never know where the keys are. And of late, I can't tell the difference between then and than. This is just a new one that got developed in the last 3 months. It just, now I can't write. I never get that right. So look, I'm not confused. I live with this stuff, and there are some real liabilities. However, I know for a fact that I have a superpower, and the vast majority of people who have neurodiverse brains in similar ways to mine absolutely have a superpower. And I think the inverse is true. I think we are now at a point where we need to teach normal brain people to think and to have the advantages that dyslexics have.
Okay, so I have a neurodiverse brain too. I don't have dyslexia. I don't have any diagnosed learning differences, but I have bipolar 2. And something I really want to talk to you about is leaving work in typical organizations because I just couldn't figure out how to work there. But I know that my mental illness, and especially my anxiety, I can't really say great things about the depression because it just sucks. My anxiety has made me into the person I am and into the leader I am, into the curious, innovative, thoughtful, empathetic, good manager person I am. It helps me see around corners. It helps me bring diverse opinions together. And I am grateful to it, even though sometimes I hate it too.
Yeah, well, you pretty much summed it up. My superpowers are a little bit different, but...
Tell me.
So I had a therapist who tested me once describe it as this way. The vast majority of people are bottoms-up thinkers. And that is to say they need to see the piece parts and how the piece parts come together. And if you could imagine a puzzle, then when the piece parts come together, ta-da, they can see the whole picture. And a lot of people in business say that they are tops-down thinkers, when in reality, the vast majority of people are bottoms-up thinkers. I am truly a tops-down thinker. As a matter of fact, I can't tolerate the detail of the pieces unless I have the raison d'etre of the big picture. And so I'm a very tops-down thinker. I'm a very strategic thinker. And like many, many, many dyslexics, I'm able to see things that other people don't see. I'm able to see patterns that other people don't see. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is there are people who find their place in the world. And if you look at a lot of the way we've structured our world, it's really structured to help us find our place. School, for example, is all about finding your place. You try this, you try that. You know, maybe you're good at math, maybe you're not. Maybe it's English, maybe you're artistic, maybe you're athletic, maybe you're some combination, whatever it is. And the unspoken about school is what there is to do is spend all this time figuring out what you like, aka are good at, and where you fit in so that you can come out of school with acquired knowledge and get a job that pays you to apply that knowledge. And the higher value the knowledge that you acquire, the assumption is the higher value you can create in a job by applying that knowledge. Doctor, lawyer, nurse, airline pilot, MBA, etc. And what most people do in life is they find their place by trying different things, focusing on something that speaks to them for one reason or another, acquiring knowledge in that thing, becoming credentialed in that thing, and then getting paid to apply that knowledge on an ongoing basis. I, like many, am somebody for whom there is no place. And when you realize that as a young person, you have this aha, which is, well, I can either go nuts or I can make my own place. And so I'm somebody who made his place. And I love my place.
You got thrown out of school?
Yes, ma'am.
And then started a company?
Yes, ma'am.
You've said there's not a test I failed or a class I skipped that mattered. That's a very strong statement.
It's very, very true.
Yeah. So what? So what happened?
So, I mean, the short story is if you keep failing, they throw you out. And so at 18 years old, I had continuously failed and they threw me out. At the time, I grew up with what you might consider a modest beginning, a single mom, my mother, myself, and my sister. My mom worked at a hospital as essentially a clerical administrator type role, what they called a unit coordinator, sort of the right hand of the head nurse and so forth. And so at about 15, 16, she got me a job working as an orderly, kind of part-time as I was a student. And so when they threw me out of school, I was in a band. I had always been musical, and we can talk about that if you want. I went to a fine arts school, which helped a lot. I would have got thrown out much earlier had it not been for that. So at 18, I had a choice, which was I could continue to be an orderly or I could start a company. And it was the dawn of the personal computer. And I had a good friend named Jack. We're still friends to this day. He's a wonderful guy, a wonderful father. Jack had just started working at a very small software company. The PC was really taking off. And he said, there's a huge opportunity with this thing. And I think we should go start a company doing PC stuff. And I didn't really know what any of that meant. Grade 3 math was the hardest 12 years of my life. And so I didn't know how to tie a tie. Back in the day, you had to know that stuff. And so essentially he said, look, I'll do all the tech stuff. You do the sales and marketing, and let's go for it. And we did. And you probably get a kick out of this part. When we started the company, we thought, well, nobody's going to buy from us. We're two kids. I was 18, he was 19. Wow. So we grew beards to try to look a little older. And there was a show that was on TV at the time that maybe you'll recall called Remington Steele.
Absolutely.
And do you remember the premise for the show, Maura?
It was Pierce Brosnan, though, right?
It was Pierce Brosnan. However, what the show was really about was a woman wanted to be a private investigator and start her own agency. But she thought, well, nobody's going to hire a female private eye. This is in the 80s, right?
Right.
So the gal, I'm going to start an agency. I'm going to name it after a guy, and then I'm going to hire the guy to play the owner. And that's Remington Steele. So Jack and I thought, hey, that's a great idea. Let's make up a guy. So we did. So we called the company Roger Pierce and Associates, or we lived in Montreal. So we actually called the company Roger Pierce et Associés. And everybody just assumed that Roger was this 50-something-year-old successful guy, and we were these, young bucks working for Roger.
Wow. Was that your first insight of how much marketing is sort of BS, but also magical and intoxicating?
It was a very personal, probably my first most personal insight. So today we call what we do around here category design. And what is now category design has been in my head as long as I can remember. And I've tried to leave category design alone my whole life. And I had an aha after my first book, Play Bigger, came out, which was, I do not own category design, and neither do my co-creators and partners in creating this discipline. It owns me. Said in a different way, I don't think it thinks me. So even as a boy, I can remember looking at businesses going, why are they doing that? That's a stupid thing to say. That makes absolutely no freaking sense. Why aren't they doing this? So it's always sort of been there. And then when I started in business, because I had no education, no relationships, no money, no experience, and it was just Jack and I and the phone book, I had to do a lot of reading. And so I just went nuts, and I read, I fell in love with David Ogilvy and Reese and Trout and, so many other of the legendary marketing and entrepreneurial books. And so I started honing my mind to that. And it was just, at the time, it was just a very practical decision. It's like, well, nobody's going to hire these teenagers. And so we need to look a lot bigger and more important and more stable than we probably look. And so, ta-da, Roger Pierce et Associés.
And what happened with Roger Pierce et Associés?
Well, we were very successful. We did end up having associés over time. And like a lot of startups, especially startups started by two young guys who don't know shit from Shinola, we wrapped it around the axle. And so it actually wasn't a sales and marketing thing. It was a failure to be able to manage the growth of the business thing.
Yeah.
And we ended up getting in a bunch of debt and getting caught in a corner. And, I didn't grow up with any money, so all these numbers seemed massive to me. And so we decided that it was time to shut the doors, and we faced an opportunity to go bankrupt technically, but we refused to do that because we made these commitments to these people. And so we figured out all the best ways we could, to the best of our ability, to care for our clients and hand them off to good people that we knew in the industry and this and that. And then we took our debt and cut it in half, and Jack and I paid it off over time.
Wow. That's a big lesson for young people.
Yes. And many people said, just go bankrupt. This is business. This is how it works. I have rejected that premise from the very beginning. It's not just business. We're people. You're a person. I'm a person. We're doing this together. Awesome. But you're a person. It's not just business. It's personal. And it always has been. And frankly, the reason I have the life I have, forget the career that I have, the reason I have the life that I have is because of the fact that I never treated business different than life.
I wonder, because you said you had no place in the typical order of things. You made your place in your business, and it was that much more meaningful to you because you had no place else to go.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally. I was terrified. I had long quit my orderly job. There was a recession going on at the time, which was part of our calculus. I literally had no plan. I was 21 years old. I had just gotten married. I thought my life was over. It was horrible. It was dramatic. It was terrifying. I was in debt. I was literally like, okay, well, if I get a paper route, I can do that. I could go work at a car wash. I could do that. Like, it was that kind of a situation.
Were you depressed? Did you get depressed?
Yes, for sure.
So how did you lift yourself up from the hole?
I'm happy to share the specifics. But before I do that, just before we got going on Roger Pierce, I made arguably the most important decision I've ever made in my life. And I remember it clearly. Just before the start of Roger Pierce, I was 17, not doing well in school, young man trying to figure it out in the world, playing in bands, playing in bars, doing all this stuff, trying to figure my life out. And the way I would describe it is like having an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. And the angel was my grandfather telling me I'm the bestest boy in the world and I can do anything. And the other voice was my mother saying, you're not allowed to grow up to be a bum. And she was right. She's like, you can do whatever you want, but you do not grow up to be a bum. You're going to be a man. And so I had this, you're going to be a bum on one shoulder and you're the bestest boy in the world, as my grandfather bounced me on my knee, who used to tell me. And my grandfather had just died. And I was facing what at the time felt like a very serious choice in life. And the choice was I going to be a bum or was I going to be the bestest boy in the world? And I remember exactly where I was. It was a very cold day. I was walking on a street in Montreal called Côte de Neige. It was February. And I decided enough's enough, Lochhead. You are going to be the man that your grandfather says you are. No more bullshit.
Wow.
And of course, I wavered. I had many, many tough moments after that where I called that decision into question. But when Roger Pierce failed, as depressed as I was and having no kind of way forward, and I didn't have a rich uncle or dad or anything like that, and obviously I had no education, I just said, listen, you're going to figure this out. And I had built many, many great relationships at Roger Pierce, Jack and I, and this is such a great story. I never thought about it this way until you asked. In the process of shutting it down honorably, or as honorably as we could, we called everybody and told them, and we owned it. We said, we're shutting down. We failed. It's a bummer. Here's what we're doing. So one of the people that I called during that process was a very successful local entrepreneur in the software business whose name was Bill Walker. And I admired and respected him very much, kind of had him up on a pedestal. We sort of had a good sort of collaborative, not deep relationship, but mutual respect, I think. And I think I didn't realize it as much at the time, but there are a lot of older folks in business who take a shine on purpose to somebody younger and kind of take them under their wing. And Bill had done a little bit of that with me, which was incredible. Anyway, long story longer, I called him, told him, and I said, look, I'm starting a new startup. Please don't take another job. I'm going away on vacation. I'm back in a week. Let's meet the minute I'm back, and I want you to come help me start this company.
Wow.
And so that's what happened.
And in that company, were you who you are, or did you invent another
Well,
figurehead?
I was growing. Of course, I'm a very young person at the time. So the purposeful growth of a person is occurring, if you will. And I was somebody for whom I had to unpack a lot of Samsonites.
Yeah.
I've done, as I know you have, a lot of work. And I had begun that process of that work. I started as a teenager.
I just got that reference to unpacking your baggage.
Yeah.
Took me a minute there.
Yeah. And I'm happy to report that I do not drag those Samsonites around and haven't for a very long time.
Wow.
Yeah, I went for it. And I did the best possible job I could possibly do. And the company was successful, and they promoted me, and they gave me raises, and they moved me to Toronto, and I opened the Toronto office, and I did that. And, I did that for a while. Then I joined another startup and had a somewhat similar run. And then I decided to do my own independent consulting gig. And I built another little firm and ultimately sold that company when I was 27, going on 28, to a Silicon Valley-based software company that was already public called Vantive. And so at 28 years old, I became the head of marketing for a publicly traded company and moved from Toronto to Silicon Valley and kind of never looked back. But I had many, many, many moments where I had to look myself in the eye and say, are you going to crumble? Or are you going to produce results? And I became a person who prides himself in my ability to produce results no matter what. You could take my word to the bank.
What happens when all your, as our unusual brains do, gets in the way? When you read something wrong, when you make a mistake because you've done a number wrong, does that just feel like part of life to you?
It certainly does now. It's nothing now. I mean, it's irritating. This then thing that's shown up in the last few months really pisses me off. And look, as somebody who collaborates on producing 8,000 to 10,000 words every 2 to 3 weeks, so I'm essentially always writing, it's irritating as fuck. But I'm completely used to it. And what I have built over time, when I didn't get diagnosed till I was 21. I'm 54 years old.
Oh, interesting.
So I was born in 1968. I'm a student in the 70s. Most people don't even know dyslexia is a thing or neurodiversity. That word doesn't even exist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I actually didn't get diagnosed till I was 21. And my entire education made sense to me. And for me, and I've talked to other dyslexics and I've had doctors and, this is an area I've tried to spend time in and support others in. Some people say their diagnosis is a negative thing that happens to them. For me, it was freeing. It was like, oh, now I get it. Now in business, when I was young, I tried to hide it, just like I had tried to hide it in school. I knew I was very smart, and I was afraid people were going to discover I was stupid. And I couldn't figure out why I could be so smart and had a hard time spelling my own last name. But I was ashamed of it as a kid. And I still was as a young entrepreneur and young executive. And then once I had, we have an expression in Canada for producing results called putting some moose on the hood. Once I'd put some moose on the hood in business and I had began to see what was possible for me and I could point to results that were undeniable, I became more and more comfortable and more open.
Yeah.
And so by the time I got to, I wasn't front and center at Vantive, but by my next CMO gig, it was. And it was sort of, at Vantive, I was sort of not hiding it, but not really talking about it either. You know what I mean? And by the time I did my I did 3 CMO gigs of public companies, but when I did my second one, I was fully out of the closet as a dysfunclic.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days. all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
You were out with these differences, which of course are often called learning disabilities. I have a question for you, for our listeners who might be listening to this story, because you talked at the beginning how you didn't have a place to go, and you didn't, certainly I imagine, have a clear ladder into corporate success, but you created your own corporate success. What was it about the organizations that you thrived in, or how did you approach your work at those organizations that allowed you to thrive in large systems,
Great question.
with your brain? Yeah.
I stopped pretending to be an entrepreneur and executive. And I became radically myself. And as part of that, completely understood my value. And as part of that, and this is something that a lot of people have a tough time with, and I think it's a superpower for many of us who are neurodiverse. I was always an entrepreneur / entrepreneurial, and I never, ever, ever submitted myself into being a candidate. Ever. And so I start with, and now it's something we teach in category design. In category design today, we call it reject the premise. And it's what I've done naturally my whole life. So I'll give you a concrete example. So a CEO would call and say, hey, you're this young, hot CMO, and we're looking for a new CMO, and, I'd love to talk to you. And so I'd say, great, let's talk. And somewhere in the conversation, I would say to her or him, well, what are you looking for in a CMO? They'd say, oh, we want somebody who can, build our brand and build demand and do product marketing, go through the checklist of things that the marketing leader does.
Right.
And I said, oh, okay, great. I said, well, look, I do all those things, but if that's what you're looking for, I'm not your guy. So we can cut this conversation short. I can give you the rest of the hour back, and God bless you, good luck, and away we go. And then they go, well, hold on a minute. What do you mean that's not what you do? I said, well, the basic blocking and tackling and marketing, I could do all those things, of course, but it's not my superpower. I'd say, oh, well, what's your superpower? I say, oh, okay. My superpower is, it turns out if you study the way startup companies work, every startup faces a roughly 18 to 36 month period where there is an epic battle for who's going to be the winner in this category. And that company typically earns 2/3 of the economics. I specialize in designing and winning that battle. But that's not what you're looking for, so, good luck. And then the CEO would say, tell me about that.
Right, of course.
And so now I'm not a candidate for a job. I have done one of the things that we teach in category design, which is most companies, and because most companies are run by most people, therefore most people fall into the comparison trap.
Yeah.
And category designers force a choice, not a comparison. It's about different, not better.
Mm-hmm. You call it your exponential different versus an incremental better.
Correct. My whole life is dedicated to the exponential different. And I don't say that pejoratively to the incremental better.
Yeah.
You take 10 or 15 years of incremental better and put them together, and you could have something really special. And sometimes in a company, an incremental better can have a meaningful increase in margins or OpEx or CapEx or revenue or what have you. And so there are a lot of really smart people working on incremental better that makes a very big difference. So I don't mean that pejoratively. However, that said, the vast majority of people in the world work on the incremental better. My superpower is the exponential different. And it goes back to having a neurodiverse brain. And it also goes back to having a healthy disregard for the way that it is.
I said on a recent podcast, I'm a questioner and I question people's expectations. And so I spent my whole life saying, That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Why should I do that? That's like pretty much my response to when people ask me to do things that I think are a waste of time, which happens a lot of time in work.
Yes. Yes. And so when you refuse to be compared, when you know that you have trained and developed yourself to produce legendary results, and when you know you're different, and when you know you're different makes an exponential different, then what there is to do is declare it. And so I have personally not competed with anybody for a very long time. I mean, in business, of course, you ultimately end up doing some competing.
Yeah.
But in life, no. I mean, look, we just published Snow Leopard. And Snow Leopard, the subtitle is How Legendary Writers Create a Category of One. And to do the book, we did the largest category science research project ever done on why business books sell and why they don't. And we were told that by Nielsen, the folks that we bought the sales data from to do the analysis. And when we published it, Maura, people in the publishing industry, people in the podcast industry said to us, why are you publishing this? This is the biggest unlock on how ideas scale that I've seen in as long as I can remember. And if you kept this research and these insights to yourself, you would have such a massive competitive advantage over everybody else. Why wouldn't you spend the next 10 or 20 years using this advantage and then publish it?
Yeah.
And the response to that is simple. That's exactly what you do if you're competing. We're in the legend creating business. Our mission is to support, empower, encourage people to follow their different, to make a big difference in the world. We live at a time where we need as many people as possible making as much of an exponential difference as possible. And what drives us nuts in the case of writing is who knows how many legendary contributions could have been made or could be made by people with great ideas, great research, great insight, but they fail to gain traction because they don't know category design, because they don't know actually how business works. They don't know that the vast majority of what we've been taught about business is completely effing wrong. And so they don't know these things. Some people think this is part of the problem with social media, and I'm a big social media fan, but this problem, this word follower, we're not in the business of collecting followers. We're in the business of creating exponential, legendary category designers and creators and innovators and entrepreneurs. And if you want to create more legendary in the world, when you learn a massive unlock about how to do that, you want to share it with the world.
Okay, but I want to ask you this. Because I also know for me along the way, I quit a lot of jobs. I got pushed out of a lot of jobs. There was a lot of pain and suffering because, like you, I knew I was so smart. I knew I had so much to offer, but I just couldn't seem to get heard by the right people. I never fit, and I always just left until I started working for myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want everyone who feels like us to have to go and start and do their own thing. That's not right for everyone. So if you're listening and you're like, yes, I get this, but I really want to keep this job and I want to do well because I really like this company and I really like what I'm doing, what's your advice? Do you try to learn to fit, or do you simply become yourself? What did you call it? Your radical self? You became radically yourself?
So the answer is both. There's some amount, and actually this is one of the big unlocks in Snow Leopard. So one of the big unlocks we had is people who make a giant difference in the world intuitively get this. This is how it tends to go. They have a radical insight based on something that is what you might call a non-obvious insight. Every exponential breakthrough, by definition, is non-obvious. However, if you just begin to communicate, evangelize, share the non-obvious, most people can't get it because they live in an obvious world.
Mm-hmm.
As neurodiverse people, I'll roll around in the non-obvious with you all day, every day. I love it. You know, one of our favorite expressions is thinking about thinking is the most important kind of thinking. We, not that long ago, had Roger Martin on, and, you know, an hour and a half long conversation about thinking is like my idea of a very good time. It's not most people's.
Right.
And so the unlock in the Snow Leopard research was the tying together of the non-obvious and the obvious. because the obvious makes it go kerplunk for people. So simple example, to go back to the legendary Gladwell, tipping point, non-obvious. First time we hear that, we don't know what that means.
Right.
The subtitle of the book, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like how small ideas turn into big change, or big, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Very obvious. And so whether you're a writer, or an entrepreneur, marketer, or just a person trying to have a legendary career who is different, your different is your non-obvious. And if you just communicate your non-obvious, there will be some people who get the value in that, for sure. And you can have a very legendary career radically embracing your non-obvious. However, the scale of impact you make will be truncated because there's not an obvious connection.
Yeah.
So you have to take the how little ideas change the world, or whatever the subtitle of Gladwell's book is, and connect it to tipping point.
Wow. I just had an aha.
Okay, what's the aha you just had?
I need more connection to the obvious for my work to reach a bigger audience.
Yes. And part of it is reach a bigger audience. The other part of it, and I know enough about you to take this guess, is make a much bigger difference. Because you're trying to make a difference with this podcast. Most people are not having this kind of conversation. I mean, the name of the podcast, right? Most people are not trying to have this kind of a radical, transparent conversation about mental well-being in the business world. It's just still fairly fringe. I know it's growing, and that's really good, but it's still not something that is very mainstream. And a lot of people view it as a weakness, and so forth and so on. You know more about that than I do. But yes, if you were able to take your non-obvious and tie it with some obvious, the results would be exponential. And every legendary entrepreneur, innovator, creator, artist, social change driver of all time was a category designer who created a new category of thinking about something by way of connecting something non-obvious to an obvious application.
Christopher Lochhead, I want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You're very welcome. And Maura, thank you for doing this incredibly important work.
That's it for today's show. Our show is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to the LinkedIn Presents family, to all of our guests for sharing their stories, and to our advertisers who bring you the show. If you love The Anxious Achiever, tell your friends. Subscribe, leave a review, follow us. You can also tweet me at MauraAM or find me on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, message me, or subscribe to my newsletter for more from the Anxious Achiever world. Thanks for listening.